Good morning. My name's Tim, if you don't know me, if you haven't met me, and along with the lovely Laura, who has been leading us in our music this morning, we've been here at this church for about 2 years, and we are Salvation Army officers, trained as Salvation Army officers with Craig and Donna, so it's great to be back in the team again. But we have the incredible privilege of being assistant managers over at the Salvation Army's Recovery Services Centre, or Moonya as it's more affectionately known. So one of the things that we get to talk about occasionally at Moonya is defects of character, and one of my defects of character is spending far too long scrolling through Facebook looking for funny quotes and funny pictures. And the good news about the good thing for me about being invited to come and speak is that I get to inflict those things on you for a little while. So, but as the panel was talking, and what a great picture that showed to us of some of the generational differences between us, which is what we're going to have a look at in these pictures. But someone in the panel reminded me of one that I haven't included, which I remember, and that was... I remember when I was, and this is true of me, I remember when I was a kid we had a TV that didn't have a remote, and I remember because I was the remote. So there'd be some of us that can relate to that. But there'd be some here today who would remember this, that when I was a kid there were no phones or tablets, so we read cereal boxes at breakfast. I had this picture up on my computer at one stage during the week, and someone came into my office and went, "Yeah, and they even had little games and puzzles on the back." And it's true, they did. But for the younger generation, we might kind of be a little bit cynical when Grandma wants to unfriend somebody. I'm sure that's not any grandma here, I'm sure. Absolutely not. Now, there's been comments that our world is becoming increasingly antisocial. Now, I don't know if you can see, I'm going to put some circles around some things here, but all these circles, if you can see them, represent what? Mobile phones. Mobile phones. Ethan told me I had to use the laser, so there we go. Mobile phones everywhere, because we get on a train, and disappear into our phones. I mean, it's a much more antisocial world than it used to be, isn't it? Now, these days, family holidays get captured by Facebook, I think, very often for young people. And so for this next young person, on the blackboard, when the picture pops up, you'll see on the blackboard it says this week's assignment is to tell us about your recent holiday. What did I do on my summer vacation? And a little boy's just holding up his phone, and the teacher says, "No, I don't want to just look at your Facebook page." But that little boy went home, and his mother had a look through his assignment and suggested that he might consult the spell checker. For those that can't see, that says dictionary. But there may be those who would suggest, as this one says, "When I was a kid, this was my computer." Now, we won't, but I almost want to ask anyone who can write that neatly on one of those things to stand up, and we applaud them, because it was just impossible. But, for a young person these days, it's more about the Wi-Fi, and so the Wi-Fi went down for 5 minutes, so I had to talk to my family. They seem like nice people. But I'm not sure if this happens in anyone else's household. I'm going to refer to parents and kids a lot because that's my reality, that's my experience right now. And I think I might laminate this next picture, put it up on my wall at home where my children can see it often. And it tells us that don't get mad at your parents when they ask you to explain how new technology works. They taught you how to use a spoon. I can hear a parent relating to that one, but it's as true as it is funny, isn't it? That there's this generational divide between us, and I guess that's what we're looking at in this series of Growing Young, and it's a priority of this church to look to how do we address that, how do we wrestle with that, how do we walk through that as a church community and as a faith community. And some of the research tells us that as we focus our attention towards how we treat our young people, it changes the dynamics of how we all treat one another. And so we're looking at this series Growing Young and championing the intergenerational church, because there's this generational divide, and it just feels like it's going faster and getting deeper and getting broader the faster our world goes. And so it's a great and a really important thing for us to look at. So over the last few weeks, we started off this series with the looking at the idea of lead me so I can lead them, about asking God for those of us who are on a faith journey to lead us so that we can lead others authentically. And then the following week, we looked at taking Jesus' message seriously, and we heard a little bit of a reflection on the fact that a lot of research tells us that these days we think that young people are anti-God, when in reality they're maybe not so wrapped up in church, but those that have exposure to Jesus actually find Jesus very appealing. And so they take Jesus' message very seriously. And last week, Toddy talked to us about unlocking key chain leadership, releasing people into leadership and what that looks like, and not just dumping people in the deep end and saying, there you go, swim. Now, over the 3 weeks ago, or over the last 3 weeks, we've given out some booklets that kind of have some summary and some extra information and a place to take notes. If you've got that with you, you might want to grab it and take some notes today if you think they're worth taking. And if you don't think they're worth taking, that's okay. Keep the page blank and write your own notes when you get home. But this week, we're going to have a look at empathising with today's young people. What does it mean to I guess, be able to understand or step into or feel something of the world of young people? Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time today looking at today's young people. What I want to really focus on is this idea of empathise. What is it to empathise? What is empathy? And this idea, I was so just excited, I guess, for want of a better word, to be asked to present on this, because I just have such a high value on empathy. I just think empathy is just something that's so powerful. And as we unpack this, I want to tell you that this is not just about growing our church young. This is not just about growing ourselves young. This is about enhancing our relationships. This is going to transform us as we continue to grow in empathy. It's going to enable us to go into new places in our relationships with our spouses, with our parents, with our kids, with our friends, with our neighbours. Empathy has the power to unlock a whole new level of relationship for us. And so whether you're on a faith journey, whether you see yourself as part of a church, wherever you're at today, I actually really think that there's potential for there to be something here for you. So I just want to acknowledge that and just invite you to seek to mine the gold, find the gold for you today that has the power to transform your journey and your relationship, because I actually believe empathy is that powerful. I believe really, really strongly in it. So let's just quickly unpack a little bit of what empathy is before we have a look at a story where we can see some beautiful expressions of empathy. So I want to suggest, if you've read through this chapter in the book, you'd see some probably other fleshing out, some other definitions of this. For me today, I want to propose empathy to be to see beyond what is seen and hear beyond what is heard. To feel with and to build connection. To see beyond what is seen, to hear beyond what is heard, to feel with and to build connection. And empathy isn't patronising, it's not sympathy, it's not passive-aggressive judgment. You know, as parents, I think we can be guilty of doing what we think is empathy, and what we're doing is actually received as passive-aggressive judgment. You know, I'm sorry to hear that you haven't got your school assignment done, maybe if you hadn't spent so long on Facebook. Any parents guilty of that, or is that just me? It might be just me. But we kind of think we're stepping into their world and being empathetic, when in fact what we're doing is we're actually just got this kind of secret way of just criticising or correcting or instructing, and sometimes the people that we're wanting to offer that to are not in the place yet to be able to receive that. And so empathy is not those things. Empathy is actually not even to know what someone is going through or to say, I know what you're going through. Because we actually have our own worldview. We see the eyes through the lens of our own experiences. We see the world through the eyes of all that makes up who we are. And that's unique and individual for each and every person. And so empathy isn't even to say, I know exactly what you're going through. Some would suggest that empathy is to see, to recognise an emotion in another person and to be able to speak that emotion out. Sometimes one of the most powerful things that can happen when particularly if we're in a really tough spot, and even actually if we're in a really good spot and we're celebrating something, sometimes what can be really powerful is just to have someone hear us and say, wow, that sounds like it would be really painful. And to feel validated in our feeling and our emotion, and to go, actually, I hadn't thought about it like that, but yeah, it does. Wow, that sounds like it would. I'd get really angry if someone did that. So it's okay to be angry. And so just to be able to identify the emotion and speak it out is an incredible empathetic gift to people. And so that can be something of what empathy is. Some would suggest that it's actually even to go perhaps even a step further and to see the emotion and find the corresponding emotional experience within your own world and allow yourself to feel that. And so it's not to impose my experiences. It's not to sit there and to say, I know just what you're going through. Back when I was 12, it's not to tell my story. It's to, within my own consciousness, to recognise something of what I felt that person might be feeling, and to be able to offer to them what I needed in that time. Not to tell them that I know, not to impose my story, but to be present in that with them, to be fully present with them. There's a great clip by a lady named Brené Brown on empathy, and I think it's going to go on the Facebook page for NBC, or it may have already gone on the NBC Facebook page. That might help if you wanted to unpack this a little bit further and just see what she has to say about empathy. And I just also wanted to highlight that empathy is not about trying to fix something or to make it better. Sometimes I think that as parents, as older people relating to younger people, we want to make things right. When we've got compassion and kindness in our heart towards someone and we see them struggling or hurting, we want to kind of fix it. Husbands to wives, this is a huge mistake that us blokes can make because we often tend to be fixers. And so empathy is not trying to fix something or make it better. Now, just to qualify that, empathy may lead us to compassionate action. At times, our empathy may cause us to act in compassionate ways, but that action will always be cooperative. I'm not going to take it away from the other person. It's cooperative, it's supportive, it's respectful, and it's optional for the other person. I'm not going to impose my action because that's not an empathetic approach. Action inspired by empathy is not disempowering, it's not directive, and it's not diminishing towards the other person. We don't take that person's right to feel away. We don't take that person's right to have control of their own destiny in that sense away. We don't fix it for them because that's not an empathetic response. It's a sympathetic response. Sympathy stands on the sidelines, a little bit removed. Empathy's on the playing field. I was thinking about this and I kind of thought empathy's a little bit like at a game of footy. As a spectator, you sit on the sidelines and someone cops a big tackle and you go, ooh, that hurt. Empathy is the guy standing next to him who's already taken some of his own tackles, who hears the thud as he hits the ground and feels the sweat splatter onto his face. He's there in the game with him. Empathy's in the game, not on the sidelines. And what empathy does is it builds a bridge to connection. It allows us to walk together. This is a huge topic and I couldn't possibly unpack it in 5-10 minutes today. And so I'd encourage us, if it's something that's tweaking at your heart today, to spend some time looking up, Googling, reading books, encyclopedias, for those that aren't sure what Google is. There's counselling courses. There's so much of counselling is learning empathy, and so there's courses that go for years and years to help us unpack this stuff. And some of us are more natural at it than others. Some of us tend to be more task-driven, more goal-oriented, more outcome-focused. And I think that perhaps we can struggle in that context to be empathetic because we want to get to the end result rather than just sit in the discomfort of the moment for a little while. And so some of us are better at empathy than others, and yet at the same time I think we can all grow in this. I think we can all learn. I think there's something for each and every one of us in developing empathy. And so here we are in the context of a church, and so where are we going to look for some ideas on what empathy might look like and what we might learn from that, well, it probably goes without saying that we're going to look at the Bible. And for me, more often than not, well, my go-to is the life of Jesus and to see what he experienced. And as I was thinking about this, I thought, you know what? I reckon that, we won't do this, but I reckon I could go around the room and ask you to tell me a story of Jesus that you're aware of, that you're familiar with, and we could begin to look at where Jesus displayed empathy. And Kath's going to come and read one of those stories to us. And as she comes, so if you just want to come on up, Kath. But what Jesus had this knack, and I want to encourage you to look for this in this story, because Jesus had this knack of causing a person to feel seen, allowing a person to feel heard, important, valued and accepted. Seen, heard, valued, accepted, important. That's what empathy does. And Jesus did it time and time and time again. So let's listen for that in this story. Thanks, Kath.
Yeah, morning, church. What an opportunity we have today to worship and connect together. So praise God. So my name's Catherine. I'm bringing the reading to you from John 8, 1 to 11, from the Passion Translation. An adulteress forgiven. Jesus walked up the Mount of Olives near the city where he spent the night. Then at dawn, Jesus appeared in the temple courts again. And soon all the people gathered around to listen to his words. So he sat down and taught them. Then in the middle of his teaching, the religious scholars and the Pharisees broke through the crowd and brought a woman who had been caught in the act of committing adultery, and made her stand in the middle of everyone. Then they said to Jesus, "Teacher, we caught this woman in the very act of adultery. Doesn't Moses' law command us to stone to death a woman like this? Tell us what to do. What do you say we should do with her?" They were only testing Jesus because they hoped to trap him with his own words and accuse him of breaking the laws of Moses. But Jesus didn't answer them. Instead, he simply bent down and wrote in the dust with his finger. Angry, they kept insisting that he answer their question. So Jesus stood up and looked at them and said, "Let's have the man who has never had a sinful desire throw the first stone at her." And then he bent over again and wrote some more words in the dust. Upon hearing that, her accusers slowly left the crowd, one at a time, beginning with the oldest to the youngest, with a convicted conscience, until finally Jesus was left alone with a woman, still standing there in front of him. So he stood back up and said to her, "Dear woman, where are your accusers? Is there no one here to condemn you?" Looking around, she replied, "I see no one, Lord." Jesus said, "Then I certainly don't condemn you either. Go, and from now on, be free from a life of sin."
Awesome. Thanks, Kath. Great job. It's not an easy thing to get up here and do that, so thank you so much. What a beautiful picture. What an incredible story. And as we unpack that, I hope you get a feel for something of Jesus' empathy. And I think, as I think about this story, one of the reasons that empathy is so valuable and so important is because, when I'm going to put myself in the category of adults for a moment, when we as adults turn to a young person who comes to us and just for example might want to tell us about how they've been experiencing some bullying online, some cyberbullying or something like that. And when we, with our fix-it mind, want to try and help without empathy, say something like, "Well, maybe you just need to get off social media." To the young person, it feels like a rock being grabbed and an arm being propped. It feels like you're criticising the way I relate to my peers. You're condemning the way my world is and the way my life exists. You're tearing me apart. And the same applies the opposite way. Because, young people, when we, do you hear that? Young people, when we turn to someone older and whether, and say the good old, "Oh, okay, boomer." Wow, that got a better response last night than it did today. I thought we'd have... It's this new phrase that's been going around over the last couple of months. Okay, boomer. When we discard what an older person might want to share with us because, "Oh, you're so old, what would you know?" That can cause an older person to feel vulnerable, naked, quivering, on show, like this woman standing there. And what empathy does is empathy drops the arm. Empathy puts down the rock. Empathy offers dignity. Empathy offers trust. Empathy says, "I see you, I value you." Empathy says, "I actually don't really understand what it's like for you. Can you help me understand?" Empathy says, "What do we have in common?" Empathy says, "I care." And in that story we just heard, Jesus did all of that in all of about 3 minutes. It's incredible. I don't think I could do that, and we couldn't unpack that properly in 3 minutes today. But let's have a quick look and see at what Jesus did in those moments and what it might help us to see empathy might look like. So we start at verse 6 from that reading, and it says they were only testing Jesus, right? So these religious leaders get this crowd all riled up and dragging this woman caught in adultery. They were only testing Jesus because they hoped to trap him with his own words and accuse him of breaking the laws of Moses. But Jesus didn't answer them. Here's this moment where the whole agenda of this whole charade was to put Jesus on show, to actually bring some judgment and some condemnation of Jesus, to undermine his authority, to question his integrity. That's what the whole charade was about. And Jesus did not respond, because Jesus saw in the middle of this charade a woman on show being used as a pawn in a game. Because empathy focuses on the other, not on the self. If we want to offer empathy, we may need to put ourselves aside for a little while and focus on the other. Now, just as a quick qualifying statement, empathy is about building and developing relationship. And I'm not suggesting that we always, in every situation, have to put ourselves aside and be treated like a doormat. If people are treating us in such a way, or if things are happening in our world in such a way that relationship is being undermined, then it's possibly not the time to put yourself aside. So I'm not talking about being a doormat, but in that building connection that empathy provides, on that bridge of building connection, we may need to put ourselves aside and focus on the other. Verse 6 goes on, but Jesus didn't answer them. Instead, he simply bent down and wrote in the dust with his finger. Angry, they kept on insisting that he answer their question. In the Message translation, it says they kept badgering him. I love that picture. Angry, they kept badgering him that he answered their question, so Jesus stood up and looked at them. Jesus bent down and just rubbing his finger on the pavers, on the dust. And when I play this scene in my head, I'm just like, it just feels like Jesus had all the time in the world. I don't today, so I need to keep moving, but it just felt like Jesus had all the time in the world. He wasn't going to be pushed. He wasn't going to be rushed. He wasn't going to have to rush off to his next appointment, or to go, hang on, I was teaching here. Let me just get back to the topic that I was teaching. He had all the time in the world, because empathy doesn't rush, and I would suggest that empathy can't rush. He didn't respond immediately. There's another story, and we may be hearing some more of this story in a couple of weeks, I'm not sure, but there's another story where Jesus went and encountered another lady where he sat on the side of a well and just sat with her and took time to ask her questions. And interestingly, he already knew the answers to the questions, but he took the time to ask the question and engage this woman and walk in relationship. And so empathy doesn't rush. In fact, it can't rush. But I need to. So I'm going to jump down to verse 10, and it says, until finally Jesus was left alone with the woman still standing there in front of him. So he stood back up and said to her, "Dear woman." See, empathy sees beyond, like I said before, sees beyond what is seen. I mean, if we were to play this in our mind, we might ask ourselves, well, what does an adulterous woman look like? And I knew you'd ask that question, so here's one I prepared earlier. Can we bring in the adulterous woman? I'm joking. We haven't. I was tempted to call for a volunteer, but no. But even in saying that, what picture came to our mind in that moment? What sort of person is going to be walked in and what are they going to look like? Because we have these perceptions, these notions, these ideas, and somehow Jesus was able to just look past all of that. Somehow Jesus was able to look past whatever condition this woman was in. It says she was caught in the very act of adultery. She may have been dragged in nothing but what God gifted to her. Maybe she had a bed sheet, I don't know. But Jesus was able to look past all of that and to see a person, not a problem. See, these religious leaders in the crowd were bringing to Jesus a problem to be solved, something to be fixed, a riddle to be overcome. But Jesus looked beyond and saw the person, not the problem. He didn't see the actions of the woman. He didn't see the actions of the man that was with the woman who wasn't there in that scene, which is really interesting all in of itself. He saw people, not problems. Dear woman. It probably doesn't sound in that translation, it probably doesn't sound as tender and gentle as I think it was, because we have a different perspective of this. You know, woman is kind of a little bit more of an abrupt term for us. But in Jesus' day, for a female to even be referenced directly was phenomenal. The value, the position of women in society was significantly different to what it is today, and they had very little identity, if any, especially apart from any husband. And Jesus has this beautiful, gentle affirmation for her and sees her for who she is, dear woman. So I want to ask us today, if we're thinking about empathising with today's young people, for those of us that are older, what do we see when we look at young people? Do we see the problems? When we look at young people we don't understand, do we see issues, difficulties, problems? Young people, you don't get off the hook here either. When we look at old people, do we see people who we feel like are just judging us? Do we see people who are disconnected from our world? Do we see that people that don't understand us? Empathy looks beyond all of that. As parents, I said before, I'd refer to parents a bit, I think. As parents, it's so easy to see our kids' behaviour, to look at the behaviour and to forget to see the soon-to-be teen or the soon-to-be adult, the soon-to-be parent who's asking us to show them how to see and how to be. It's so easy to see the behaviour and get stuck there. The best parts of this story are still to come, so I want to keep moving on. Actually, I'm jumping around a little bit because we're going to go back to verse 9. And it says that upon hearing that, so Jesus made this challenge to the crowd and to the religious leaders. If any of you have got it all together, if any of you have never struggled with something in your life, if any of you have never been tempted to do something that you know is not wrong, if any of you have never stumbled in a moral sense, then how about you throw the first stone? And upon hearing that, her accusers slowly left the crowd one at a time, beginning with the oldest to the youngest with a convicted conscience, until finally Jesus was left alone with the woman still standing there in front of him. So he stood back up and said to her, "Dear woman, where are your accusers? Is there no one here to condemn you?" And what I see in this interaction is an incredible amount of dignity. Empathy offers dignity, not disgust. Jesus could have offered disgust, judgment, criticism to the woman for her behaviour. And Jesus could have offered disgust, judgment and criticism to the religious leaders, to the crowd. Look at you crowd. You're just getting wrapped up in someone else's agenda and going along for the ride. You've got this whole crowd mentality. What are you thinking? Wake up to yourselves and think for yourself. Jesus could have done and said all that, and he didn't. He offered dignity to every single person in that moment. Every one of them. See, I think it's easy in this story for those of us that have heard this story lots of times to see how Jesus offered empathy and dignity and lots of else to the woman, but he offered it to the crowd as well. And one of the reasons that I say that is that it said that the crowd left one by one from the oldest to the youngest. Now, if we are going to follow somebody, if we are going to allow somebody to lead us, we will do that when we hold that person with some respect, when we hold that person with some dignity. If we don't believe that they've got anything to offer us, if their character has been completely demolished, we're not going to allow them to lead us. Now, it tells us that the crowd dropped their rocks from the oldest to the youngest, and I think that what this tells me, as I saw this in new light, is that the young people still held in esteem the older ones. They were willing to learn from them. They were willing to follow them. The older ones dropped the rocks. The younger ones thought, wow, there must be something in this. And the reason they thought that is because Jesus still offered them dignity. He didn't diminish the character of the older religious leaders. He didn't diminish the personhood of the religious leaders. He simply offered empathy and dignity even to them in that moment. And the young people were able to hold their leaders in respect and to follow them because of the dignity that Jesus offered. I've pretty much already covered this because the other thing that we see is that empathy is for everyone throughout this story. Jesus offers this. He doesn't respond in the ways that we might expect even to the judgmental. The woman, the leaders, the crowd, Jesus offers them all empathy and dignity, young or old. You know, even the ones who were judgmental, rude, disrespectful and manipulative, Jesus offered empathy to them too. And how often do we find ourselves, particularly in intergenerational challenges, but in any kind of conflict or difficulty, and we feel like someone's being judgmental or rude or manipulative towards us, somehow we can even find within ourselves the ability to offer some empathy towards them. And it can transform the way we interact. And finally, at the tail end of the story, there's this interesting verse where Jesus says, "Then certainly I don't condemn you either. Go and from now on be free from a life of sin." Right at the end of his story, Jesus then puts a little bit of a challenge out to this woman's behaviour. Because empathy positions us for instruction. If we want the right to offer instruction into someone's life, empathy will be part of the stepping stones that might get us to earn that right with somebody. A great Salvation Army officer down in Sydney by the name of Robin Moulds gave me, I heard her speak once and heard this equation that she gave, and I found it so helpful. It's never left me since. And it goes like this: truth minus relationship equals judgment. Truth declared to somebody without the context of safe, loving relationship will most of the time only be received as judgment. If we are speaking something that may be true to somebody that they really need to hear, that might be difficult to hear, but they don't know that we have their best interests at heart, they don't know that we care for them, they don't know that we have their dignity held for them, if they don't know that truth can't be received into the spirit, into the soul, into the mind, into the heart, because it actually comes across as judgment. Truth minus relationship equals judgment. And so empathy positions for instruction. So Jesus displayed this phenomenal empathy in this story to everyone. He showed us that empathy focuses on the other, doesn't rush, sees beyond, offers dignity. Empathy is for everyone. It positions us for instruction. And so this morning, I wonder where you're at on the empathy journey. I just want to start by saying this Jesus is the Jesus who I follow. And I know that For some of us in this room, it's highly likely that people who have carried the name and the representation of God, church, or Jesus at times have not displayed this. That you may not have received empathy, you may have received other things. And if that's you today, I want to say, I'm sorry that that is your experience. Because that's not the Jesus of the Bible. And we're human and we get it wrong sometimes, and I'm sorry for the times when we've got it wrong. But I want you to know that if you feel like the woman caught in adultery, surrounded by a bunch of people wanting to throw stones at you, I want you to know there is a Jesus who wants to offer you empathy, dignity, time. He wants to focus on you. That's the Jesus who we're talking about today. That's the Jesus who we follow. And I hope somehow you can find that and experience that. For those of us today who claim to follow Jesus, we can all grow in this journey of empathy. And so maybe it would be helpful, maybe it wouldn't, but just as we close out this time today, I just thought, let's have some stones out here, some rocks, some symbols of these people who had an agenda and laid it down in the context of empathy. And there's some pens here that will write on the rocks, and maybe you want to just come and write empathy on one side of the rock and judgment on the other or something, so you see it at home and are reminded. Maybe you want to write one of those points down on the rock. Last night I found myself prompted to grab a rock and just write empathy, focus on the other, take time. That was my response last night. Maybe that it'll be helpful for you to come and take a rock and do something with that. Maybe it's just a case of having the rock to remind you of the story. I'm not sure. Some of us may want to just spend some time with God and maybe just ask God for his empathy, ask him to show it, to pray, maybe to ask him to grow it within us for those of us that are followers of Jesus. Whatever's helpful for you this morning, this opportunity is yours to do that. And I just want to say, just to help our prayer team out, what we thought we might suggest this morning is if you'd like to just come and just spend some moments by yourself and just pray by yourself, why don't you come and kneel out the front and just as a way of saying, I'm just going to have some time by myself. But if you would like someone to pray with you, I want to invite you to come and stand, and there'll be some people around who'll be happy to pray with you. And by standing, you're kind of making a statement that I would just love someone to be with me in this. I want someone alongside me. I want someone to step off the sidelines and into the game with me. And we would love to have some people available to do that for you. So there's some rocks to grab and write on if you wish, some opportunities for prayer. And I'd just love to just pray a quick prayer now before we move into that space. So loving God, we come to you. And thank you, Jesus, that you displayed incredible empathy, and we have so much we can take from that and so much we can learn. God, would you please make me more empathetic? Would you help me to grow in this? Would you help us as a church to empathise with our young people, with our old people, with our children, with our middle agers, with our families, with our singles? Grow our hearts of empathy, I pray. And God, may we experience your care, your kindness, your love, your mercy, your empathy in our lives today. Continue to speak to us and lead us, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen.